Frozen, beaten, and without clothes, she crawled to his cabin and he let her live like a queen. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her, but it offered little protection against the freezing air. Every step she took sank into the soft, icy snow, and her tired legs screamed with pain. She shivered violently, unable to stop the trembling that ran from her fingers to her toes. She had been walking for hours, maybe even days, though time seemed meaningless in this endless white wilderness. Her body ached in every corner, her muscles, her joints, even her bones. Every breath she took felt like a small battle against the harsh cold. She had lost track of where she was, and the landscape around her seemed to stretch endlessly, a frozen desert without any signs of life. Trees stood like silent, skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The sky above was a dull gray, blending with the snow-covered ground so perfectly that it was hard to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Her mind was foggy from cold and fatigue, and each step felt heavier than the last. Her thoughts wandered, a mixture of fear and determination. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the choices she had made, and the dangers she had faced along the way. Every decision seemed to have led her to this frozen place, but she refused to give up. She had survived hardships before, though never like this. This was different. This was raw, relentless survival. Her hands were numb, and she could barely feel them as she tried to keep moving. Her coat was torn in places, offering even less protection against the harsh wind. Her boots were soaked with melting snow, making each step an ordeal. Her fingers and toes ached with a deep, burning cold that no amount of movement could shake off. She tried to remember the basics of survival she had learned from books and stories: keep moving, stay warm, find shelter. But in this blinding white wilderness, everything seemed impossible. As she continued, her mind flashed back to the moment when everything had gone wrong. She had been traveling alone, thinking she could manage whatever came her way. But a sudden storm had caught her by surprise, stronger than any she had ever experienced. The wind had howled through the trees, throwing snow into her face and obscuring her path. She had stumbled, fallen, and gotten lost. And then the injuries came, small at first, but enough to slow her down, enough to make her realize that every step forward would be painful. She paused for a moment, leaning against a tree for support. Her body was trembling uncontrollably, and her teeth chattered in her jaw. She could barely see through the snow in her eyes, which had become red from the wind. She tried to take a deep breath, but the cold air burned her lungs. Her body was warning her, telling her to stop, but she knew that stopping could mean death. The thought of freezing here alone terrified her more than the cold itself. Her stomach growled weakly, a reminder that she hadn't eaten properly for a long time. Hunger gnawed at her from the inside, making her feel weaker with every passing moment. She had tried to ration her food, but it was not enough to sustain her energy in this cruel environment. She had no choice but to keep moving, even though each step was agony. The snow around her was unbroken, except for her own tracks, which she could barely make out in the storm. Every so often, she would stumble over a hidden root or a patch of ice, falling painfully into the snow. She tried to rise each time, her body aching and exhausted, but she refused to lie down and give up. She thought about the people she loved, the life she still wanted to live, and the small spark of hope that pushed her forward. Hours passed, or maybe it was days, she could no longer tell. Her mind was clouded and the landscape never seemed to change. Her body screamed in protest, but she ignored it, focusing only on the small goal ahead: survival. She imagined warmth, food, and safety, even though it seemed like an impossible dream in this frozen wasteland. Her clothes were soaked and tattered, her hair frozen in icy strands that clung to her face. Every movement was painful, and every breath felt like a battle. She could feel frost forming on her eyelashes and eyebrows, and her lips had turned a pale, bluish color. The cold was relentless, creeping into every part of her being. But even in this desperation, she refused to give up. Something deep inside told her that she had to keep going, that there was a way out if she could just hold on. Suddenly, through the blizzard, she thought she saw something in the distance. At first, she wasn't sure if her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. But then she saw it again, a faint shape dark against the white snow. She squinted, trying to make it out. It was a cabin, small and simple, standing alone in the middle of the frozen expanse. Her heart leapt. Shelter, warmth, safety. She had never wanted anything more in her life. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she forced herself to move toward the cabin. Each step was more difficult than the last, her legs trembling and burning with pain. Snow filled her boots, soaking her feet, and her fingers were so numb that she could barely grasp the branches for support. But the cabin was there, a tiny beacon of hope in the endless white wilderness. She focused only on that, blocking out the pain, the cold, and the hunger. As she drew closer, exhaustion threatened to overtake her. She stumbled several times, falling hard into the snow. Her hands and knees were scraped and bruised, and the sharp wind cut through her coat. But each time she fell, she forced herself to rise, driven by the thought of survival. She could almost feel the warmth of a fire, hear the sound of a door closing behind her, and taste the relief of safety. Her body was failing her, and she could feel herself slipping into a dangerous fog of hypothermia. Her movement slowed, her thoughts became disoriented, and the snow seemed to blur around her. She knew she was close to collapsing, but she refused to give in. She whispered to herself, words barely audible over the howling wind. Just a little further, just a little further. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was simple, made of wood, but it looked solid and welcoming. She crawled the last few feet, her body shaking violently, her energy nearly gone. She pressed herself against the wall, too weak to stand, and took shallow, ragged breaths. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a small, trembling sigh of relief. Though she was battered, frozen, and weak, she had made it this far. She had survived the worst of the storm and the cruel winter landscape. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself rest, knowing that she had a chance to survive if she could just get inside. The cabin was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of hope, a promise of warmth and safety in the midst of an unforgiving wilderness. Little did she know that inside the cabin awaited someone who would change her life forever. Someone who would see her not as a victim, but as a person worthy of care, dignity, and compassion. But for now, all she could do was summon the last bit of strength to reach the door and hope that help was waiting on the other side. With trembling arms and frostbitten fingers, she began to move toward the cabin door, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. Every inch forward was a battle, but she refused to stop. Each movement brought her closer to warmth, closer to life, and farther from the frozen death that had been chasing her. She did not know what awaited inside, but she knew one thing: she would fight to live, no matter what it took. And with that determination, she inched forward, crawling through the snow, frozen and beaten, toward a fate that would change her life forever. The snow crunched beneath her hands as she dragged herself closer to the cabin. Each movement felt like a battle. Her body screamed in protest, but a quiet, stubborn determination pushed her forward. Her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, misting in the icy air and disappearing almost as quickly as they formed. The world seemed to be fading into a blur of white, yet the dark outline of the cabin grew slowly clearer. It was small, unassuming, and made of rough wood, but it stood as a beacon of hope in the middle of the frozen wilderness. Her fingers were numb, and frost had begun to form along the edges of her clothes. She tried to ignore the painful stiffness in her limbs, focusing only on the cabin. She imagined a fire inside, a warm room with blankets and hot food, and the image gave her a small spark of energy. Even in her weakened state, her mind clung to that hope. She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, "I will make it. I must make it." Her stomach growled faintly, a painful reminder that she had not eaten in what felt like days. Hunger gnawed at her, adding to the fatigue that already weighed her down. She had carried a small bag with provisions when she began her journey, but most of it had been lost or ruined during the storm. She had tried to ration the little she had, but it was not enough to sustain her energy. Each step was exhausting, and her thoughts grew foggy. She could feel her mind drifting, struggling to stay alert in the numbing cold. Suddenly, her foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice. She fell hard onto her side, snow filling her clothes and freezing instantly. Pain shot through her body, making her cry out despite the wind's roar. She stayed there for a moment, too tired and frozen to move. Every muscle in her body burned, her hands and feet throbbing from the cold. Yet she knew she could not stay down. The thought of giving up was unbearable. Somewhere inside, a voice urged her to push forward to survive. With great effort, she pushed herself up on her hands and knees. The cold pierced her skin, but she forced her numb fingers to grip the icy ground and pull herself forward. She could see the cabin more clearly now, its wooden door a small, dark rectangle in the endless white. She tried to focus only on that, letting the cold and pain exist only at the edge of her awareness. Every movement was agonizing, yet she refused to stop. She was driven by something deeper than fear, a desire to live, to reach warmth and safety, to escape the frozen wilderness that threatened to claim her. Her thoughts drifted back to how she had ended up here. She had never imagined her journey would take such a dangerous turn. She had been traveling alone, confident in her abilities and experience, but the storm had caught her off guard. It had come suddenly, a relentless force of wind and snow that buried everything in a thick, blinding white. She had tried to find shelter, but the storm had grown stronger, more violent with each passing hour. She had slipped, fallen, and injured herself, making it impossible to keep pace with the conditions around her. The realization that she was completely alone had hit her hard, and fear had threatened to paralyze her. Yet, even in the darkness of her situation, she refused to succumb. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was raw, unforgiving, and unrelenting. She had no one to rely on, no help nearby, and no guarantee of survival. Her body ached, her clothes were soaked and shredded, and the snow had frozen onto her hair and eyelashes. But a stubborn spark of hope burned inside her, guiding each painstaking movement. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached a small clearing around the cabin. She collapsed onto the ground, unable to take another step, her body trembling violently. She pressed her face into the snow, letting out a shallow, shivering breath. The cabin stood there, silent and still, yet full of possibility. It was her only chance to survive. She stared at it, willing her body to respond, willing herself to find the strength to move. She knew she had no time to waste. The cold was relentless, and every passing minute brought her closer to danger. Gathering the last bit of energy she had, she inched forward on her hands and knees. The snow was hard and unyielding, cutting into her skin through the thin fabric of her clothes. Her lips were cracked and blue, her cheeks frozen and raw from the wind. She shivered uncontrollably, but she refused to give up. Her mind focused entirely on the door of the cabin, imagining what awaited inside: warmth, safety, perhaps even food. The thought of relief gave her a renewed sense of determination. As she reached the door, she tried to stand, but her legs refused to support her. She had grown too weak, too cold, and too exhausted to rise. For a moment, despair crept into her thoughts, whispering that perhaps she had come too far, that her body would fail her before she could reach safety. But even then, she refused to surrender. Slowly, painfully, she crawled toward the door, her hands scraping against the frozen wooden steps. The warmth she imagined inside seemed just out of reach, a fragile promise she clung to with all her remaining strength. She pressed her hand against the cold wood, testing the door. It was locked, or perhaps just stuck from the cold, but she didn't have the strength to force it open immediately. Her fingers were numb and the pain made her wince, yet she refused to give up. She could hear the wind outside, howling and relentless, and she knew that every moment counted. She whispered to herself again, just a little more, just a little more, and pushed with all her strength. At last the door creaked open slightly, a small victory in her long, grueling struggle. A thin ray of warmth from inside reached her, brushing against her frozen skin. The smell of wood smoke and something cooked faintly in the air hit her senses, filling her with relief and hope. She pushed the door open a little further, enough to slip her body through the gap. As soon as she stepped inside, the warmth hit her like a wave, and she collapsed onto the wooden floor, shivering but alive. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. A fire burned gently in the hearth, sending out waves of heat that slowly began to thaw her frozen body. The scent of something warm and hearty cooking drifted through the air, and she realized how long it had been since she had smelled anything like it. Her teeth chattered violently, but the warmth creeping into her limbs made her feel safe for the first time in days. She had made it, she was alive, and the nightmare of the storm was behind her, at least for now. As she lay there, recovering from the shock and exhaustion, she thought about how fragile life could be. Just hours ago, she had been on the brink of losing everything: her life, her hope, her will to survive. And now she had found a place of safety, a temporary refuge from the harshness of the world outside. Her heart filled with gratitude, and yet a small part of her remained wary. She had survived this far, but she knew that survival was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt that she might be able to overcome them. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into her bones. The cabin was quiet except for the gentle crackling of the fire. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to rest, to breathe, and to believe that she could make it through this ordeal. She had come so far, faced so much, and still she had survived. That alone gave her the strength to continue, to recover, and to face whatever came next. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, she felt a small sense of peace. She was not completely safe yet, and the world outside was still dangerous, but for the first time she had hope. She could recover, she could heal, and she could survive. And with that thought, she let herself rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to reclaim her life. She lay on the wooden floor, shivering violently as the warmth of the cabin slowly began to seep into her frozen body. Every inch of her felt heavy, exhausted from the relentless struggle outside. Her clothes were wet and torn, her skin red and raw from the biting wind, and her body ached in every part. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a tiny spark of hope. She had survived the storm, survived the freezing wilderness, and now, perhaps, there was a chance she could truly live again. The cabin was small but cozy. A fire burned gently in the hearth, sending waves of warmth across the room. The wooden walls gave a sense of security, a feeling that she hadn't experienced in days. The faint smell of smoke mixed with something warm and savory hung in the air. She tried to take a deep breath, but the cold had made her lungs sore, and every inhale hurt. Still, she felt relief and safety, something that had seemed impossible just hours ago. As she tried to gather her strength, she noticed movement from the corner of her blurred vision. A man appeared in the doorway of the cabin. He was middle-aged, rugged, with eyes that seemed calm yet alert. His face carried the lines of someone who had lived through hardships, someone who understood the struggle to survive. He had seen her collapse outside and had quickly come to check, and now he stood silently, watching her. The woman's heart raced, a mix of fear and relief flooding her chest. She had been alone for so long, and the sight of another human being was both comforting and intimidating. She wanted to speak, to ask for help, but her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. The man knelt beside her carefully, his movements deliberate and gentle. "You're safe now," he said in a calm, soothing voice. "You're inside and the fire will warm you. Let's get you out of these wet clothes and warmed up." Even in her weakened state, she felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She nodded faintly, unable to speak, and let him guide her to a small chair near the fire. The warmth immediately began to ease the stiffness in her body, though the pain from her injuries and the cold still lingered. Her fingers were still numb, and she could feel frost forming on her hair and eyelashes. The man moved quickly, but carefully. He brought a blanket and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. He fetched a towel and gently helped her remove the wet, torn clothing, replacing it with dry, warm clothes he had prepared. She could barely believe it. After days of freezing in the wilderness, she was finally being cared for. The smallest acts of kindness, a blanket, a change of clothes, felt like miracles. "Take your time," he said gently. "You've been through a lot. We'll start slow." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the blanket wrap her like a shield against the cold and the pain. She felt her muscles relax slightly for the first time in days. She wanted to cry, to release the tension, exhaustion, and fear that had built up inside her, but she was too weak. Instead, she just let herself breathe, feeling safe for the first time in what seemed like forever. The man moved to the hearth, stirring the fire and adding more logs. The cabin filled with a stronger, more comforting heat. He then brought over a bowl of something warm to drink, a simple broth, but it smelled nourishing and delicious. She took a small sip, and warmth spread through her chest with each swallow. For the first time, her stomach didn't ache with hunger. It felt satisfied, nourished, alive. As she drank, the man watched her carefully. He didn't ask too many questions right away. He didn't press for details she might not be ready to share. He understood that right now, the most important thing was her safety, her warmth, and her recovery. His calm presence was comforting, and she began to feel that perhaps she could trust him. Slowly, the woman started to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I was lost in the storm," she said, her words trembling. "I didn't know if I'd make it." He nodded, his eyes gentle. "You made it, that's what matters, you're safe now." The simplicity of his words was reassuring. After everything she had endured, she realized how much she needed someone to acknowledge her struggle without judgment, someone who would simply offer help. She had faced the cold and the pain alone, and it was the first time she had felt truly cared for in days. Time passed slowly as she rested by the fire. The warmth began to seep deeper into her frozen limbs, and the shivering that had consumed her gradually lessened. Her muscles relaxed slightly, and the aching pain in her joints became more bearable. The man continued to move around the cabin, tending to small tasks quietly. He chopped more wood, checked the fire, and made sure everything was in order. He didn't hover, but his presence was steady, reassuring. She felt her eyelids grow heavy, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to drift into a light, exhausted sleep. The fire crackled softly in the background, and the cabin felt like a world apart from the harsh wilderness outside. She dreamed briefly of warmth, of soft beds, and of safety, a life she hadn't thought she would see again. When she awoke, she felt slightly stronger. Her body was still weak, but the warmth and food had begun to restore her energy. She looked around and realized how small the cabin was, yet how complete it felt. Everything she needed at that moment, safety, warmth, sustenance, was there. She felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the man who had helped her. He was preparing a simple breakfast now, moving around quietly, yet his calmness filled the room with security. "Are you feeling a little better?" he asked, glancing at her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice still weak but more confident than before. "A little." He smiled faintly, not boastful or proud, just gentle. "Good. Eat slowly. The body needs time to recover." She took small bites, savoring the food, feeling the nourishment restore strength she had almost forgotten she had. Her mind wandered, reflecting on how close she had come to losing everything in the storm. She realized that the cabin, the fire, the food, and the man's kindness were a turning point. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim of circumstance. She felt like someone who could recover, who could heal, and perhaps even begin to live again. After breakfast, the man offered her a warm blanket and a chair by the fire. "Rest," he said simply. "There's no hurry. You've been through a lot." She nodded, letting the warmth envelop her once more. For the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to feel safe. The fear that had dominated her thoughts for days began to fade slightly. She realized that while she had survived the storm physically, it was the kindness and care of another human being that was helping her survive emotionally. Hours passed, and she slowly regained strength. Her mind became clearer, less fogged by exhaustion and hypothermia. She realized how fragile life could be and how much it could change in an instant. Just hours ago, she had been crawling through snow, battered and freezing, unsure if she would live. Now she was warm, fed, and cared for, a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could shift when someone extended kindness and compassion. Throughout the day, the man remained nearby, offering gentle assistance whenever needed, but never pressuring her. He fetched more blankets, tended the fire, and offered water and food at intervals. She felt a deep sense of trust developing between them. She realized that sometimes, survival wasn't just about enduring the elements. It was about the people who could help you when you were at your weakest. As evening approached, she looked around the cabin, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in days. It was more than just a shelter. It was a sanctuary. The storm outside still raged in her memory, but here, she could rest, heal, and begin to recover. The warmth of the fire, the kindness of the man, and the simple comforts of the cabin gave her hope for the future. She realized that life could be harsh and cruel, but it could also be gentle and giving, especially when someone extended a helping hand. She finally allowed herself to close her eyes, feeling safe, cared for, and slowly growing stronger. The man checked on her one last time before night fell, ensuring she was comfortable, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside there was peace, warmth, and the promise of recovery. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that she could survive, that she could heal, and that life could still offer hope, even after the harshest storm. The days that followed were quiet, yet full of small moments that slowly began to rebuild her strength and spirit. Each morning, she woke to the warmth of the fire and the soft sound of the wind outside the cabin. The cold that had once numbed her fingers and toes now seemed like a distant memory, though her body still carried the aches and stiffness from her ordeal. The food she ate, the blankets she wrapped around herself, and the gentle care of the man helped her recover both physically and emotionally. The man remained patient, never rushing her or asking questions she was not ready to answer. Instead, he focused on the practical, keeping the fire going, bringing her food and water, and checking to make sure she was comfortable. Every small gesture made her feel safer, more cared for, and gradually her fear began to fade. She realized that being alive wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about the support and kindness of another person who could help her regain her strength. With each passing day, she became a little stronger. She could sit by the fire longer without shivering, eat without her stomach turning from exhaustion, and move around the cabin without feeling completely drained. Her injuries, though still tender, began to heal. The bruises on her arms and legs slowly faded, and the scratches on her hands began to scab over. Even her spirit, once broken and desperate, started to feel whole again. She often watched the man as he worked quietly around the cabin, chopping wood, tending the fire, and repairing small things that needed attention. She noticed how calm and deliberate his movements were, how he seemed to take care of everything without rushing or stressing. There was a gentle patience about him, a kindness that made her feel safe. For the first time in weeks, she felt that she could trust someone completely. One morning, after a night of deep, restful sleep, she attempted to stand on her own. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from days of crawling and limited movement, but she forced herself to take small steps around the cabin. The man watched her carefully, offering support only when she needed it, never hovering or making her feel incapable. Each step was a victory, a reminder that she was regaining her independence and control over her life. "You're doing well," he said quietly, a small smile on his face. "Take your time. Strength comes slowly, but it comes." She nodded, feeling warmth rise in her chest, not just from the fire, but from the acknowledgement of her progress. It was more than just physical recovery. It was emotional healing as well. She had been so close to losing everything, and now, slowly, she was finding her way back to life. The small acts of care and attention from the man reminded her that compassion could exist even in the harshest of circumstances. As days turned into a week, their routine became steady. She helped with small tasks around the cabin, fetching firewood, preparing simple meals, and tidying the small space. These actions, though minor, gave her a sense of purpose and belonging. She began to feel useful, not just a helpless victim of circumstance. Each task completed, each small contribution, strengthened her confidence and reminded her that she was capable of more than she had thought. Their conversations, when they happened, were gentle and thoughtful. He asked her about her journey, listening carefully to her story, but never pressing her for details she was not ready to share. She began to open up slowly, sharing memories of her life before the storm, her hopes, and even her fears. He listened with patience and understanding, offering reassurance and perspective without judgment. Through these conversations, she realized that recovery was not just about healing the body. It was about trusting someone, sharing her story, and allowing herself to feel safe again. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the cabin windows, she found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. The warmth of the sun on her face, the comfort of a blanket, and the simple presence of another human being made her feel alive again. She realized that life, even after such extreme hardship, could still hold moments of joy and beauty. The small cabin, once just a refuge from the storm, had become a sanctuary, a place where she could begin to rebuild her life and her sense of self. The man noticed her smile and nodded quietly. "You're doing well," he said. "It takes time, but you'll be stronger than before." His words, simple as they were, carried weight. They reminded her that recovery was not linear, but that persistence, patience, and care could lead to transformation. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for his presence, for the guidance, support, and kindness he offered without expectation. Slowly, she began to understand that she was not just surviving, she was starting to live again. Evenings in the cabin became moments of quiet reflection. They would sit by the fire, the warmth wrapping around them, and sometimes speak about the world beyond the cabin. She listened to his stories of life, of challenges he had faced, and of moments of hope that had carried him through difficult times. Through these stories, she realized that resilience was not just physical, it was also emotional and mental. She began to see that her own journey, though harrowing, had given her strength she had not known she possessed. As she regained her strength, she also began to think about her future. The storm had taken so much from her, her freedom, her safety, her certainty. But it had also brought her to this place, to this man who had offered her care and protection. She realized that life could offer second chances, even in the most unexpected ways. The idea that she could build a new beginning, even in this remote cabin, gave her hope and purpose. One morning, after a week of steady recovery, she decided to step outside briefly. The snow still blanketed the ground, but the air felt slightly warmer than before. She took small steps, letting the crunch of the snow beneath her boots remind her that she was alive, that her body was growing stronger. The man stood nearby, watching carefully but not interfering. He nodded when she glanced at him, a silent affirmation of her progress. As she looked around at the frozen landscape, she realized that the world, though harsh, could also be beautiful. The snow-covered trees sparkled in the sunlight, the sky held shades of soft blues and pinks, and the quiet of the wilderness felt peaceful rather than threatening. She understood now that life was not only about enduring hardship, but also about finding moments of beauty and peace amidst the struggle. Days turned into weeks, and her recovery continued. She could walk more confidently, tend to small tasks independently, and even engage in light conversation. The man continued to offer guidance and support, but he also gave her the space to regain her autonomy. She began to feel a sense of belonging, a feeling that the cabin and the man were now part of her life. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts was replaced with gratitude, trust, and a quiet strength. Through these weeks she transformed, not just physically but emotionally. The broken, desperate person who had crawled through the snow was now a woman who could stand, move, and think clearly. She had regained her dignity, her confidence, and her sense of self. She realized that survival was not just about escaping danger. It was about healing, trusting, and allowing oneself to be cared for. By the time she was fully recovered, she felt like a new person. The cabin, once just a refuge, had become a home. The man who had helped her was no longer just a caretaker. He was a guide, a friend, and someone who had shown her the power of kindness and compassion. She had learned that even in the darkest times, people could make a difference, and that one act of care could change the course of a life. She understood now that life's challenges were not meant to break her, but to show her strength she hadn't known existed. The cold, the storm, the exhaustion, and fear had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. Yet, through it all, she had survived, and in surviving she had discovered resilience, hope, and the profound impact of human kindness. And so, in the quiet cabin, surrounded by warmth and care, she began a new chapter of her life. She was no longer just a survivor. She was someone who had been transformed, healed, and empowered. The man's unwavering support had given her the foundation to rebuild herself, and she knew that the lessons she had learned about courage, gratitude, and the strength of the human spirit would stay with her forever. By the time spring approached, the snow outside had begun to melt, and the frozen landscape slowly transformed into a scene of quiet beauty. The harsh cold that had once defined her days and nights was now a memory, softened by warmth and care. She had regained her strength, her confidence, and her sense of self. The woman who had crawled through the snow, frozen, beaten, and alone, was no longer a victim of circumstance. She had survived, healed, and found hope in a place she never expected. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, had become her home. Its wooden walls, the fire that crackled endlessly, and the small belongings that now filled the space gave her a sense of permanence she hadn't felt for a long time. She moved around freely now, tending to daily tasks with a steady hand. Cooking, cleaning, chopping wood, and even organizing small improvements around the cabin gave her purpose. Each action reminded her that she was not just surviving, she was living fully again. The man who had saved her remained a constant presence, though the dynamic between them had shifted. He was no longer just a caretaker or a helper. He had become a companion, a friend, and someone whose guidance she valued deeply. Together, they maintained the cabin, shared meals, and spoke of life, the past, and the future. The bond that had formed through shared adversity now rested on trust, mutual respect, and quiet companionship. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, she stood by the fire and looked around the small space that had become so dear to her. She realized how far she had come, from a state of despair and vulnerability to a place of safety, strength, and dignity. Every bruise, every scrape, and every trembling step had led her here. She could feel the transformation within herself, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. She had regained control of her life and discovered resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The man approached with a gentle smile, holding a small basket of fresh food he had prepared. "Breakfast is ready," he said softly. "Take your time." She nodded, feeling warmth in her chest, not just from the food but from the simple act of care. She had learned to appreciate the smallest gestures, understanding that survival and happiness were built not only on extraordinary events, but also on everyday acts of kindness. As she ate, she felt the strength of her body returning fully, a sharp contrast to the weakened, battered state she had been in when she first arrived. Over the following weeks, they began to establish a routine that blended work, rest, and reflection. She tended to the cabin, helped with chores, and even began small projects to improve the space. Together, they repaired the roof, organized storage, and even planted a small garden outside, a hopeful sign that life continued and flourished, even after hardship. Each day, she felt more capable, more independent, and more confident in her abilities. The storm that had once seemed to take everything from her now felt like a distant memory, a challenge that had tested her but ultimately revealed her strength. One evening, as the sun set in shades of pink and gold, she sat outside the cabin, wrapped in a warm blanket. The man joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of trees, the distant call of birds, and the faint trickle of melting snow into a small stream nearby. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of peace that was deeper than anything she had known. The fear and desperation that had once consumed her had been replaced by gratitude, calm, and a profound appreciation for life itself. "You've come a long way," the man said softly, glancing at her. "You're stronger than you realize." She smiled, feeling tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief, gratitude, and recognition of her own growth. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. "You saved me." He shook his head gently. "No one can truly save anyone but themselves. I only offered help when it was needed. You did the hard part. You survived even when it seemed impossible." His words resonated deeply. She understood now that survival was not just about physical endurance. It was about resilience, courage, and the willingness to accept help when necessary. She had faced the worst the world could throw at her, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Days turned into weeks, and the woman continued to grow in confidence and strength. She explored the area around the cabin carefully, learning the land, collecting firewood, and even helping prepare small meals from resources she found nearby. She began to feel a sense of mastery over her environment, no longer fearing the wilderness as she had before. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, a place of safety, comfort, and hope. The bond between the man and the woman deepened with each passing day. They shared stories of their past, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. Through these conversations, she began to see the power of human connection, the way trust, kindness, and care could transform not only her life but also his. Together, they had turned a place of survival into a place of life, growth, and joy. One bright morning, as she tended to a small garden outside, she realized how much she had changed. The woman who had once crawled through snow, frozen and beaten, was now walking confidently, planting seeds that would grow into flowers and food. Her hands, once raw and frostbitten, now moved with skill and purpose. Her mind, once clouded by fear and exhaustion, was clear and focused. And her heart, once weighed down by despair, was full of hope and gratitude. She understood that life could change in the most unexpected ways. The storm that had brought her to the edge of death had also brought her to this cabin, to this man, and to a new life she had never imagined. The hardships she had endured had shaped her, revealing a strength she had not known existed. And the care and kindness she had received had shown her the power of compassion and human connection. As spring turned to summer, the cabin became more than a home. It became a symbol of resilience, hope, and transformation. The woman no longer thought of herself as someone who had been rescued. She thought of herself as someone who had survived, adapted, and grown stronger through adversity. She took pride in her accomplishments, no matter how small: the warmth of a fire she had tended, the meals she had prepared, the garden she had nurtured. Each was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, even after the most harrowing experiences. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she and the man sat by the fire outside. The sky glowed with shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the still melting snow. She felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. The fear, desperation, and pain of the past weeks seemed distant, replaced by gratitude, hope, and a quiet joy in simply being alive. "You've built a new life here," the man said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You've grown stronger than you ever knew." She smiled, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I have," she replied, "and I've learned that life can change even after the darkest moments, that we can survive and even thrive if we allow ourselves to." His eyes reflected pride and understanding, and together they watched the sun disappear behind the horizon. The wilderness around them was no longer a threat, but a beautiful, peaceful world full of opportunity. The storm that had once seemed unbeatable was now a distant memory, a test she had passed, and a lesson she would carry forever. In the following weeks, she continued to thrive. She tended the cabin, cared for the small garden, and even explored the land more confidently. The once frozen, beaten woman had transformed into someone resilient, capable, and filled with gratitude. She had discovered the strength to rebuild her life, the courage to trust again, and the wisdom to appreciate every small moment of warmth, safety, and companionship. Through the man's guidance and kindness, she had learned to live fully again. She no longer feared the wilderness or the unexpected. She faced each day with confidence and hope. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was a home, a place of life, learning, and renewal. And as she looked around at the small, cozy space she now called home, she realized that she had truly found a new beginning. The woman who had once crawled through snow, frozen and beaten, was now standing tall, warm, and safe. She had survived the storm, healed her body and spirit, and discovered the power of human kindness. She had transformed her life, and in doing so had become a living testament to resilience, hope, and the beauty of second chances. For the first time, she felt complete, not because life was perfect, but because she had overcome the impossible, found trust and companionship, and built a life filled with warmth, purpose, and gratitude. She knew that no matter what storms might come in the future, she had the strength, wisdom, and hope to face them. The past had tested her, but it had also shown her what she was capable of. And now she lived fully, gratefully, and courageously, knowing that even after the darkest moments, life could still offer light, hope, and a chance to thrive.